15 CFM less than that. So we've got them flowing really nice. Put these intake valves have been, they came with a, these are actually 300 intake valves that we installed, and 190 exhaust valves. So all severe duty Manley valves, and we upped it from originally they came with two 190 intakes, and now we have two 300s. And originally they came with 1880 exhaust valves, and now we have 190. So we went with a little larger valves. The intake runners from the factory were 195 cc's, 295 cc's, but now they are about 320s. I was a little disappointed in the intake runner volume, but these heads were originally made for 427 engines, so you know they didn't have a lot of runner volume. But that's the work we did to them. We have some nice pack, about 250 pound seat pressure springs on there for the roller cam. And I have this really neat, I bought this set of, the problem with these heads, they all broke, they cracked these rocker bosses on the exhausts every time. And this set of heads are really nice. I actually have two sets of these heads, but it's hard to find them because you know they haven't been made for many years, and most of them cracked those rocker bosses, and that's from putting a heavy spring in, you know, and running a big cam. And we're going to try to solve that problem with these T&D shaft rockers. Really nice one-piece stands. I've modified them. They were originally for Pro 1 heads, and I've modified them slightly. We just had to move over slot and move over the exhaust stands a little bit, so now they're made to fit these original GM heads. And these shaft rockers should lower the fulcrum and stabilize everything so it doesn't crack. The reason they cracked was these heads are made out of horrible porous, really cheesy aluminum. You know, these were like one of the first sets of aluminum heads ever put on a Chevrolet. So you know, they had really not the kind of aluminum that we have nowadays and the type of heat treatment and stuff. So we're going to make these heads work because they're original to the car, and it'll be a factory LS6 engine that makes good power, hopefully. But anyway, let's this process of putting the heads on and taking them back off, it's very tedious and time consuming, so I'm not going to film a lot of it, but I'll film when we take it off, and I'll show you the clay, and we'll measure the piston to valve clearance, and then we can go ahead and bolt the heads on it permanently, and then we can we'll measure for push rods and button her up. One more thing I was going to mention real quick is when we're doing this measuring and mocking up, we're going to measure for that piston to valve clearance. We're also going to measure for push rods and stuff too. It's just much easier if you have some test springs in there, so you're not compressing those big heavy springs. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this. I'm going to use this valve compressor valve spring compressor, and we're going to put these light little test springs in the number 1 cylinder. You should only have to check 1 cylinder because they should be all set up the same install height, same clearance on the valve reliefs on the pistons and everything. So we're only going to check cylinder number 1, and we're going to put test springs in number 1 and bolt it all up and torque it down with the proper gaskets. We got some nice Cometic 030 gaskets over there, reusable, and use test springs so you're not fighting. It's all installed here. You know, now there's just enough pressure on them to return them firmly to the seat, but you're not fighting 750 pounds of pressure. Got some nice ARP head bolts here. It's important to use good head bolts every time. Usually if I'm building a real wicked motor, I'll use studs. That way you can play around with any thickness gasket and studs. You know, nuts always torque down nicer, but for this stock setup here, where bolts, they come with a washer, and you've got to get this little bevel here. There it is. You got to get this little bevel toward the head of the bolt when you put it on. If you get those backwards, man, you'll have trouble. So make sure you have the washers on. Same deal as the mains. Another thing you got to watch on these stock head bolt kits is there are these bolts. The 2 end bolts on the inside on each head are about 1/4 inch shorter than all the rest. So there'll be 4 bolts in the package that are just ever so slightly shorter than the rest of them. I mean, the super short ones go on the outside by the exhaust. Those you can't get mixed up. But these long ones are just a little bit shorter, and 4 of them in the kit. Don't get them mixed up with the long ones or you'll have a problem. And when we bolt this together permanently, we're going to need some sealant on the threads, because on a stock block the head bolts go into the water jackets. Dart block or Merlin, they don't do that, but with a stock block, you've got to have sealant on the head bolt. Anytime you have a block machined, they're going to remove the alignment dowels. I actually removed them myself before I brought it to the machine shop, but you're going to have to replace these 4 alignment dowels for the head. Hippo high pressure pin oiling lifters, brand new. Can't buy a good enough lifter, too good a lifter. I usually soak them overnight in some nice 2050 before I put everything together. We'll drop them in there, and we'll set the lash with these adjustable push rods. And like I say, we're just mocking everything up for now, and when we're done rolling it over, check the lash one more time, and we'll take those push rods out and measure how long they are exactly, and then we will order the actual push rod. One more time here with one set. Piston valve clearance, super important. Got some clay on the piston here. I kind of overdid it. We got the gasket in place. I got nice 30 thousandths Cometic multi-layer stainless steel gaskets for this engine. And then we got the clay on top of the piston, and then we got a little grease on the valves, because sometimes the clay, it's just modeling clay. Sometimes it likes to stick to the valves and not the piston. We want it to remain on the piston, and then it'll leave an indentation. When we bolt on the head, we roll the engine over, and then we will measure the indentations in the clay, see how much room there is between the piston and the valve. And the right way to do it would be to use a dial indicator and roll it over. This is just kind of a for instance. Hopefully we're not too tight. If it's close, we're going to have to use a dial indicator and do this in another way. But hopefully we'll measure that clay and we'll have enough distance to be safe. Okay, here's the piston to valve clearance. You can see the impressions that got left there. This is your quench. That's cylinder to piston clearance. The intake looks pretty tight. We're going to cut it here and I'll measure it and show you. Exhaust looks like there's plenty. I'm a little worried about that intake though. One thing you want to check too is the radius on this. You want to check the thickness, you know, between the top of the valve and the pocket. And then I notice we've got plenty of clearance here between the actual block and the valve. I've kind of ported that a little bit there to help it flow better. But it looks like we've got plenty of room. This area right here looks sufficient, but I'm just worried about piston to valve clearance on that intake. Looks like plenty here. I don't know what this measurement here is, but we'll take it here. Okay, we've got this cut now, so you can see it, and it is tight, but that's about it right there. And we are reading 93 thousandths. Wow. Some guys say you want 100. Other guys say 80. Like the common consensus is 80. We've got 90 about. Exhaust valve, plenty of clearance, 180 on the exhaust. So, 90 clay measurements. I don't know how much I trust them because it was pretty close, pretty tight still on that intake side. So I've got the clay out of there now and I'm going to check it a different way here. I've got a dial indicator rigged up. First I'm going to do the exhaust and then I'm going to do the intake. Roll it over 10 degrees before top dead center for the exhaust and 10 degrees after top dead center for the intake. In that vicinity, you know, I mean, I'll start out at 15, go to 10, go to 5, you know, and see if I can find the closest when the valve's open and the piston is almost at the top. I'll find the closest the valve gets to the piston and I'll take an accurate reading, hopefully more accurate than trying to measure the clay with the dial indicator and get a more exact amount of distance between the valve and the piston at its closest point, because that intake valve is making me a little bit nervous. 87 thousandths on my clay measurement, and that's pretty tight. They say with the, I've got the light checking springs in, they say, you know, with the stiffer springs that we'll have a little more clearance because of the deflection, but I just want to measure this one more time before I go and put it all together and I just want to prevent any interference from happening the first time we fired it up on the dyno. Okay, I fiddled around with it until I got it to the tightest point between the valve and the piston on the exhaust side. And you can see we've got 100, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 79, 78, 178 thousandths. All the way around is 100, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 79. 179, and the clay I measured 180 on the exhaust side. I'm very disappointed. Intake side, I knew it was going to be tight. We got it zeroed. We go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 75. 75. 75. Supposed to have 80. And that is the tightest. We're at about 10 degrees after, top dead center. I fiddled around with it to get it down to the minimum. 75 with the test springs. I think we'll have enough deflection to get 5 thousandths out of it. Ooh, and that's with the 170 rocker on it. It's going to be time to throw the heads on. I always buy these Cometic multi-layer stainless steel gaskets. They're super duper. Kind of expensive, but they're worth it. And I always spray a little copper coat on. I know they say not to, but they're kind of wanting to sell gaskets, so you know. They are totally reusable. It's the last set of gaskets you'll ever buy unless you want to change the thickness, you know, compression ratio or something. You'll never have to buy another set. Block here we're using, so we're going to have to use some sealant on the bolts because they go through into the water jackets. If you have a Merlin or dark block, you don't have to worry about that because they're blind. But I usually use some of this Permatex Teflon thread sealant when I'm using a stock block on the threads, and then we'll use this moly lube that they send up here on top on the head and the washer, and then you should be all set to go. The real trick way to do it is with studs, but you know, that's on a racing application. This is kind of a street motor. We're not doing anything fancy with the head gaskets or anything. It's a 30 thousandths Cometic gasket. Should really be a 40, but we're trying to gain a little compression. So we don't really need the studs, but I do have the ARP bolts. So, but don't forget the sealant, or you're going to have leaks on a stock block. When you're putting the sealant on the head bolts, is a good time to make sure that your washers are not on upside down, they're on right side up. I think I covered that already in this video. There's a bevel on these ARP bolts with washers. The bevel goes toward the head, and flat always goes down on the washer. And then there's a sequence to tightening these. And then you torque, you start out at 40, and you kind of start in the middle and work your way out. You go from 40 to 60 to 80. throw the intake manifold on it, and first we'll prime the oil. You know, the old oil pump there. I'll show you what I got going here. Here's how I do this. Got an old distributor here that I have the gear taken off from. It's just an old turd that Chevrolet distributor. I'm going to stick that in the hole, and we're going to put a drill on this top part and turn the pump. First we're going to put oil in it. Here's my valve covers. We're doing this stock appearing thing, but I had to jack them up a little bit to make room for the shaft rockers. So I got some nice black valve cover gaskets. They're 3/16 rubber with a steel core, and I glued, first of all, I glued one to the valve cover, and then I glued another one. So I got two gaskets glued together here, and I bolted the valve covers down on it. And first I made sure I had clearance for these rockers, and it'll still look stock. I mean, I made sure to buy a gasket that wasn't bright blue or something. I'll show you when I get them on there. They look really nice, but for now, we had to go with some 1.7 rockers because of that piston to valve clearance. Even with the 1.7s, we're still like dangerously tight, but I'm on a budget here, and I had these 1.7 rockers. I had 6 of them. I don't like them because they're blue, but you know, beggars can't be choosers. We're on a budget. What I'm waiting on is we're gonna replace. I had to rebuild them. They're worn out. There's some rockers I got with another set, and I only had 6 of them, and those 6 I'm gonna rebuild. I'm waiting on these bearings. Otherwise, we'd have this thing all buttoned up and done. You press these bearings out of there, and then the rollers too you can replace, but a good way to test those is just to roll it over and see if you feel any coarseness. The roller tips seem to be all fine, but these shafts had a little bit of play in them I didn't like, so we've got new bearings on the way for them. Hopefully the shafts aren't worn. We'll figure it out. We'll rebuild these 6, and then I bought 2 new ones, which I already have on there. Everything, all the exhausts are on there, and 2 new intakes that I bought, and everything's all adjusted, lash and everything. And then we can throw the valve covers on too, and we'll be done. A problem with the intake that we're going to have is aftermarket heads usually don't have this heat riser, and that's for the choke. The factory intake I'm using too has the opening on it that runs up under the carburetor, and that opens a little heat coil and closes, you know, opens the choke when it gets hot. We're gonna have to block this off somehow. I'll show you that when we come to the intake. We had to hog out these push rod holes on these factory heads. See, I don't know if you can see right in there. I mocked everything all up, and it was really tight, and the reason for that is with a big cam, we've got a lot more range of motion on the rockers. Now they're swinging further. See how that one's really, come on you, it's so blurry. It's really tight, and we had to clearance both the stands and the heads so that the push rods could move freely, you know. We've got this one here on the end. You can see really it's tight, but we can still spin it. And I had to hog the holes a little bit. You know, as that thing opens, it swings back. the push rod's swinging like this with the motion of the rocker. And you've got to have a lot. The more it swings, the more room you need. So we hugged out the push rod holes a little bit, and when I'm priming it, I like to know if it's got pressure or not. And I'm going to hook this up here to the old oil pressure make it happener here. That's the only output on these stock blocks for an oil pressure gauge is there. Aftermarket block would be back here, the back of the cam tunnel it comes up from. But we'll hook this gauge up so when I run the drill, we'll see. We're gonna need a little oil in it. Run the oil pump, right? So we'll just dump a few quarts of 4 or 5 quarts. It's got a 5-quart pan, so 20-50 in there. Need to soak everything on down good. Make sure you get your cam and your lifters. And I had those lifters soaking it overnight in a pan full of oil, so see some things happening here. That's when you find out if you forgot like an oil galley plug or something, but I know we didn't do that. Let's take our handy dandy homemade pump driver here, cover down the distributor hole. Goes in there at kind of they make these things, you know, but Wheelie Hot Rod Shop, you know, they sell these drivers, but everything's homemade or 10 horsepower to drive the oil pump, but I don't know if that's true or not, you know. I don't know. People say a lot of stuff, but it does take a pretty healthy drill to run the day. Oh yeah, we got plenty of pressure. This drill is noisier than heck, but I'll show you the gauge goes up. You can see down on the rollers on the rollers for the lifters. It's really pumping. Looks good. Looks like we got a leak on our little line thingy here, but we'll tighten that up in a minute. We'll pretend we didn't see that. Three 3963. What we've got here is a 3963 512, a 512 block, dated L, which is the 12th letter in the alphabet. That's the month. L, which would be December 7th, 1970. So, December 7th, 1970, this block was cast. And that car was built the first week in January 19th, which would be correct for the car. We have a T0105 CPX, which is a 454, 425 horse automatic transmission car, and that VIN number matches that car. 1971 Corvette. It's actually, this is all 50-year-old castings. We have a 3946074 heads on it, correct. One of them is dated something like March of 1970. The other one's dated something like July of 1970. So they're not a matching set, but they are within months of the build date of the manifold on this thing. We've got to address this heat riser problem though. The reason we want to block this off is, and the reason that aftermarket heads don't even have it, is you want the charge of air going in your carburetor as cool as possible, because when the air gets hot it expands. There's less room in the combustion chamber for the oxygen molecules. So the cooler the air is, the more dense your fuel to air charge is. Anyway, you want that heat away from the intake manifold, not inside of it, and not directly underneath your carburetor. Now the easiest way to block that off would be with a set of gaskets like this. These are for dart heads, but you can see here how the intake runners are squared off kind of on this gasket. They just don't quite see those corners. It just doesn't match up quite as nice as a gasket like this. This is the gasket I like to use with that. My intake manifold has been port matched exactly to these cylinder heads, and these gaskets come from the factory with a perfect runner opening size. But the problem is they have this hole cut in them, and I can't find any gaskets with this exact runner shape that don't have the hole cut out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these right in the middle of that bolt hole. I'm going to combine the center section from this gasket with the port areas from this gasket. I'm just going to make a homemade set of intake gaskets and have that hole blocked off, because the intake that I'm using is a factory intake. It's got the hole in it also. And I'm just screwed here as far as getting the correct combination of runner openings and the heat riser blocked off. But here is a shot of one of my cool new custom made intake manifold gaskets. Gasketos. There she is. We're going to have to use a little more right stuff than I like to use, but we'll have that heat riser all blocked off this way. Okay, here's a quick shot of my homemade intake gasket. All the gaskets were the same thickness, so it should work just fine. These surfaces here, these mating surfaces, are so tiny because of those huge parts, especially in between the two. You know, I put a little right stuff on them just to seal them, but you don't want a bunch oozing into your runners or anything, so you got to kind of find a happy medium. And then these bolts are going to need sealant on them again. Almost all the intake bolts go through into the oil areas. You can see where this one actually goes through into the push rod hole. So if you put too long a bolt in that one, it'll hit the push rod and bend it. So a little sealant on those. I usually, it's okay to get carried away here on the China wall, because that's just going to ooze into where it doesn't matter. A lot of guys don't like to use any sealant on the intake gaskets themselves, but these were kind of cobbled together, and I'm always nervous about those really thin mating surfaces there between the ports and stuff. So I always use a very light coat on the rest of them, heavy coat on the China wall. It's okay if it oozes out, you can cut it off afterwards. And then I always dry fit everything and clean all the surfaces, of course, with brake clean. And then you're ready to set it in place. I don't usually tighten the bolts all the way either. I lay it in there and then I let it sit. Mount on the china walls. There's nothing more aggravating than when those leak. Almost not really easy to seal up after the fact. Alright, that looks great. Now we got it oozing out all the way front and back. It's really oozing out on back, and that's fine. And now we'll start all the bolts. Sometimes when you've had your heads milled like these have been, you might have to hog out your intake holes a little bit, which I've done already, because they don't like to line up. The more you mill your heads, it changes this V here and affects the way the intake fits. So you gotta make sure and dry fit it first and make sure your bolts are the right length, and everything's about an hour now to let that right stuff set up. And now I can torque them down to the full, 25-30 pounds. Don't ever use that stupid rubber thing they sell you in the gasket kit for the china wall. I just do not like that. I mean, a nice thick bead of right stuff is always the best way to go, I think. And then you're glued. I mean, you actually have to cut that when you go to take it apart. So there's nothing more aggravating than when that leaks. And you won't know it until you get some windage going in the engine, and you're at the track and you're making a mess, and they're backing you out of the starting line. So yeah, a little right stuff. I've cleaned off the ooze now. A lot of guys just let her ooze, but I kind of worry about how things look. I probably should have mentioned that. I'm not really an engine builder. You probably know that by now. I'm a body man by trade, so I worry about how things look. Although you never know that by looking at my pickup truck. But I'm fussy about how things look, so I trim off that ugly ooze front and back, and just take a razor blade when it's all done and make it look. And they must be on a slow boat or something, but then we'll need a carburetor. And I gotta show you something quick. The more parts I put on this engine, the more she seems to be sagging. I gotta get her off this engine stand before it falls off from it. I know I've had heavier engines than this on this stand. I've had iron-headed big blocks on here before. But we got something going on in here. I don't know. Jason borrowed it one time and lost my bolts, but maybe I got a little bolt bending issue going on or something there, but it's not looking good. I gotta get the on and adjusted, and now just throw these valve covers on, get them all clearance nice. All we have left all we have left to do now is get a carburetor, and we're ready for the dyno.